The worst first date of my life. The evening began with a shimmer of promise that Nia had not felt in years. After 3 months of witty banter over a dating app, she was finally meeting Sterling at the Gilded Lily, an upscale bistro known for its velvet booths and jazz-infused atmosphere. Nia had spent 2 hours perfecting her look, choosing a silk dress that felt like a second skin and vintage earrings passed down from her grandmother. When she arrived, Sterling was already there, looking every bit the successful architect he claimed to be. He stood as she approached, offering a smile that could melt the most cynical heart. The scent of expensive cologne and sandalwood hung around him like an invitation. As they sat, the conversation flowed with an effortless rhythm. They discussed their shared love for Neo Soul, their ambitious career goals, and the difficulty of finding genuine connection in a digital world. For the first 30 minutes, Nia found herself wondering if the search was finally over. Sterling was attentive, leaning in when she spoke, his eyes never straying from hers. It was the kind of start that makes a woman believe in magic again, unaware that the curtain was about to rise on a very different kind of show. The first crack in the evening's polished surface appeared when the waiter, Queasy, arrived to take their order. Queasy was polite and professional, reciting the specials with a rhythmic grace, but Sterling's demeanor shifted instantly. The charming man Nia had been talking to vanished, replaced by someone cold and imperious. Sterling interrupted Queasy mid-sentence, complaining that the water wasn't chilled to his specific liking, and questioning the origin of the sea bass with a condescending tone that made Nia's stomach do a slow somersault. He sent the wine back twice, once because it was too young, and once because the bottle was smudged. Queasy remained a model of patience, nodding and apologizing, but the tension at the table became a physical weight. Nia tried to smooth things over with a sympathetic smile toward the waiter, but Sterling noticed. He turned to her, his voice dropping to a sharp whisper, telling her that if one doesn't demand excellence, one will always be served mediocrity. The red flag wasn't just waving, it was hitting Nia square in the face. She watched as Sterling continued to lecture the poor man about the proper way to present a menu, realizing that the architect was far more interested in building walls than connections. Just as the appetizers arrived, a plate of seared scallops that Nia no longer had an appetite for. The front door of the bistro swung open with a violence that turned every head in the room. A woman named Keone marched toward their table, her eyes locked on Nia with a predatory focus. Before Nia could even process who the stranger was, Keone was standing over her, a storm of fury wrapped in a designer trench coat. Keone didn't look at Sterling. She looked directly at Nia and asked if she knew she was sitting in a chair paid for by another woman's alimony. The restaurant fell silent, the only sound being the soft clink of silverware from a distant table. Keone explained, in a voice that carried to the rafters, that Sterling had a penchant for auditioning new wives, while his current divorce was still a messy, unresolved battlefield. Nia felt the blood drain from her face as Keone pointed a trembling finger at her, accusing her of being just another notch in Sterling's structural integrity. The romantic lighting of the Gilded Lily now felt like a spotlight on Nia's humiliation. Sterling finally found his voice, but it wasn't to defend Nia, it was to launch a counter-assault on Keone. He stood up, knocking his chair back with a loud clatter that echoed through the bistro. The two of them began a frantic, hushed argument that quickly escalated into a public spectacle. Sterling grabbed Keone's arm, trying to usher her toward the exit, but she threw his hand off as if it were a poisonous snake. They traded barbs about secret bank accounts, a summer home in Martha's Vineyard that had been sold without permission, and a list of lies that seemed to stretch back a decade. Nia sat frozen, a spectator to the wreckage of a life she had almost stepped into. The management began to converge on the table, their faces masks of professional concern. Sterling, realizing the walls were closing in, turned back to the table not to apologize to Nia, but to grab his coat. He told Keone she was ruining his life, and told Nia he'd call her later, as if the evening hadn't just imploded in a cloud of legal drama and broken trust. He began to pull Keone toward the door, their bitter whispers filling the space where a romantic dinner should have been. Nia gathered her things and practically ran for the exit, desperate to put as much distance between herself and the drama as possible. She reached the sidewalk just in time to see Sterling and Keone still arguing near the valet stand. But the night had one more trick up its sleeve. As Sterling reached for his keys to make a grand, dramatic exit in his luxury sedan, he let out a guttural yell of frustration. Clamped firmly onto the front left wheel of his car was a bright orange metal boot. A neon yellow notice was plastered across the windshield, fluttering in the night breeze. The successful architect had apparently forgotten to pay a mountain of parking tickets. Nia watched from the shadows of the restaurant awning as Sterling kicked the tire in a fit of rage, only to limp back in pain. Keone stood by, laughing a cold, hollow laugh that seemed to punctuate the end of his facade. Nia realized then that the entire evening had been a construction of glass and smoke, and the foundation had finally given way. She reached into her purse for her phone to call a ride, but Sterling spotted her and began shouting for her to come help him talk to the parking enforcement officer who was idling nearby. Refusing to be part of his mounting catastrophe, Nia flagged down a rideshare that had just pulled up. To her horror, Sterling leaped into the back seat right behind her before she could close the door, dragging his wounded pride and his expensive coat inside. He told the driver, a sturdy man named Marcus, to just drive, and promised he'd pay double. Nia was too stunned to protest immediately. As the car pulled away from the curb, Sterling didn't apologize. Instead, he began a frantic monologue about how Keone was unstable and how the city's parking authority was targeting successful men. Marcus, trying to do his job, asked for a destination, but Sterling began arguing with him about the route, claiming Marcus was taking the long way to run up the meter. The tension in the car was thick enough to choke on. Sterling leaned forward, shouting into Marcus's ear about GPS accuracy and professional ethics. Marcus's eyes met Nia's in the rearview mirror, a shared look of, "How did we get here?" Nia realized she wasn't just on a bad date, she was a passenger in a literal and metaphorical car wreck. Sterling abruptly told Marcus to stop the car in front of a nondescript, windowless brick building in a part of town Nia didn't recognize. He claimed he needed to pick up some liquid assets from a private club to pay for the night's disasters. Against her better judgment, and mostly because she didn't want to be left on a dark corner alone at 11 p.m., Nia followed him inside. She expected a jazz club or a late-night lounge. Instead, they walked through a heavy steel door into a haze of cigar smoke and the sharp, rhythmic sound of chips clacking together. It was an illegal poker room, hidden behind the facade of a defunct dry cleaner. Sterling was greeted not as a respected member, but as a man who owed the room more than he could likely pay. He led Nia to a corner table where the air felt heavy and the lighting was a sickly yellow. He told her to just sit and look pretty while he fixed everything. Nia felt a cold shiver of dread. This wasn't a man who had hit a run of bad luck. This was a man whose entire life was a desperate gamble. Sterling sat at a high-stakes table, presided over by a man named Vance, whose face looked like it had been carved out of granite. Vance didn't move as Sterling placed his last few $100s on the felt. The game was swift and brutal. Within 20 minutes, Sterling's bravado had evaporated, replaced by a gray, shaking desperation. He lost the hand, and then he lost his head. He turned to Nia, his eyes darting to the vintage gold and pearl earrings she was wearing. In a voice that made Nia's skin crawl, he suggested to Vance that the earrings were genuine heirlooms, and surely worth enough for one more buy-in. Vance leaned forward, his cold eyes shifting from the cards to Nia's face, evaluating the jewelry as if she weren't a human being, but a display case. The room went quiet as the other players waited to see if the date from hell would turn into a robbery. Sterling reached out a hand toward Nia's ear, his fingers trembling, pleading with her to be a team player, just this once. Nia didn't wait for Vance to make a decision. She stood up, her chair screeching against the concrete floor, and slapped Sterling's hand away with a force that surprised even her. She looked Vance dead in the eye, her voice steady and echoing with a power she hadn't known she possessed. She told him that the only thing Sterling had of value was the coat on his back, and he was welcome to it. She then turned her gaze to Sterling, telling him that he was the smallest man she had ever had the misfortune of meeting. To her surprise, Vance let out a low, gravelly chuckle. He gestured toward the door, telling Nia that a woman with her backbone shouldn't be in a place like this. He signaled to one of his associates to see her out safely, ignoring Sterling's pathetic protests as the architect tried to bargain with his watch. Nia walked out of that smoky room without looking back, her heels clicking a steady, defiant rhythm against the floor. She felt the weight of the night, lifting with every step she took away from the man who had tried to bet her memories on a pair of deuces. The ride home in a different taxi was the quietest, most peaceful moment of Nia's week. She watched the city lights blur past the window, reflecting on the madness of the last 4 hours. She had gone out looking for a partner and ended up finding a cautionary tale. When she finally stepped into her apartment, she kicked off her heels and unclipped her grandmother's earrings, placing them carefully back in their velvet box. She looked at herself in the mirror. Her hair was a bit disheveled, and her makeup had faded, but her eyes were bright with the clarity of a narrow escape. She poured herself a glass of wine, one that didn't need to be sent back, and sat on her balcony, listening to the real sounds of the city. The date had been a disaster of epic proportions, a comedy of errors that would eventually make for a legendary story at brunch. But as she sat there in the silence of her own home, Nia realized that being alone was 1,000 times better than being with someone who didn't know the value of the seat they were sitting in. She picked up her phone, deleted the dating app with a single, satisfying swipe, and toasted to the best worst night of her life.